Welcome to another episode of Shane Plays Geek Talk. Thanks so much for pressing play. This week we have RPG designer Bruce Nesmith, and he's going to discuss his just, in my opinion, just fascinating career. He's a TSR veteran from back in the day, worked on things like Ravenloft 2nd Edition, Gamma World 4th Edition, Dragonlance, and a lot more. You also won't believe how Bruce got his job at TSR in the first place, and what his first day on the job was like. It was an experience, to be sure. He was also the lead designer on a little video game called Elder Scrolls Skyrim, and now he's a novelist. So I just had a great discussion with Bruce. It ran the gamut, if you will, from what he considers his biggest achievement while he was at TSR. What was his opinion of TSR under Gary Gygax versus Lorraine Williams? And what does he consider TSR's glory days? The answer might surprise you. What was Bruce's job description, actually, as he was the lead designer on the Elder Scrolls Skyrim? Why did Elder Scrolls Oblivion have a big celebrity, but Skyrim didn't? It's also interesting, Bruce was years ahead of the game when it came to his revamp of the armor class system for Gamma World 4th Edition. And what kind of feedback did he get once it released? What do you do when you want to play D&D, but you don't actually have the rules? Well, you invent it, including simulating the D20 with D6s. We also talk about writing for games versus writing prose. Also, Bruce's Loki in his novel Mischief Maker is not the MCU Loki. We go into a little bit about Loki of mythology and the trickster archetype. And then finally, at least as far as these notes go, I lament the lack of a werecow in TSR publications, but that's by no means everything we talked about. It's a great discussion. I think you'll enjoy it very much. Thanks again for listening, and here we go.
Shall we play a game?
Why, yes, I believe we shall.
Oh, I got a live one here.
Getting geeky in your speakers. It's Shane Plays Geek Talk, a journey into the things we love. I'm your host, Shane Stacks. Thanks so much for tuning in. As I always like to remind people, even though it's Shane Plays Geek Talk, it's not just about games. I'll talk about anything geeky, off of comic books, board games, tabletop role-playing games, computer games, computer role-playing games, TV shows, movies, whatever. This week, however, we have a guest that has just a really great history with both tabletop role-playing games and video games with a specific focus in computer role-playing games. So as I was sharing with him before we started recording, he's actually hard to prepare the show on because he's got such a strong history in two different areas that are major focuses of this show. So, which is a good problem to have because no matter what we talk about, it's going to be interesting. So I'm really glad to have him. It's Bruce Nesmith. You're going to be so impressed when you hear his history, which we'll get to here in a second. But Bruce, welcome to Shane Plays Geek Talk.
Oh, glad to be here, Shane. Thanks for having me.
Really glad to have you. And I want to give a quick shout out to Steve Snyder of the Me and Steve Talk RPGs podcast for the introduction to you, Bruce. And I want to it'll be in the show notes for this episode at shaneplays.com, but you can hear Bruce's discussion with Steve. And Steve, I believe, I know it's Future Steve, and I can't remember what the other Steve is called, but they're both named Steve. And it's this Me and Steve Talk RPGs podcast. You can go to shaneplays.com, find the show notes for this episode, and I'll link to that episode if you want to listen to it, or just go to podbean.com. Did I see Beam? Podbean.com and search for Me and Steve Talk RPGs podcast, and you'll find their interview with Bruce and all their other episodes. Great podcast. I really recommend it. They have a real love for tabletop role-playing games. To introduce Bruce, I'm going to read his career section from his Wikipedia page, which is probably not comprehensive. And I'll invite Bruce to fill in anything that's missing or that he wants to add. But Bruce is also now became a novelist, and he has a novel out, which we will talk about here in a moment as well, called Mischief Maker. So now that he's done with his tabletop RPG and his computer RPG, computer video game work, now he's making Mischief in the novelist world. So we will definitely talk to him about that. But listen to this. TSR, that's right, TSR Incorporated hired Bruce in 1981 to do computer games on the Apple Plus. He soon moved on to be a writer of Dungeons and Dragons modules. After the original Dragonlance group began, the Dragonlance series design team was later expanded to also include Margaret. Is it White? Bruce, is it Weiss or Weiss? I always say Weiss, but I think I say it wrong.
It's Margaret Weiss.
Hey, I said it right. Margaret Weiss, Douglas Niles, Bruce Nesmith, who we're talking to right now, Mike Brault, hoping I'm saying that right, Roger Moore, Laura Hickman, Linda Back, Michael Dobson, and Gary Spiegel. Nesmith designed Ravenloft, Realm of Terror in 1990, which built on the ideas behind the Hickman's original Ravenloft adventure in an attempt to make D&D competitive with horror role-playing games such as Call of Cthulhu and Chill. Nesmith and Andrea Hayday designed the Dragon Strike board game, which was published by TSR Incorporated. And Dragon Strike comes up a lot, Bruce, when I'm out there talking to people that are reminiscing on, I don't know if you'd call it the glory days of TSR or whatever, but that game comes up a lot. His other design work for D&D includes the War Rafts of Kron, Saber River, Master Player Screen featuring the Spindle, the Book of Liars, or the Book of Layers, not the Book of Liars. Did they ever do a Book of Liars, do you think?
That would be hysterical. I would love it if they did, but no, I'm not aware of having done it.
A whole source book just full of liars. The Book of Layers 2, Tales of the Outer Planes, Monstrous Compendium Volume 2, Monstrous Compendium Volume 1, Hall of Heroes, Monstrous Compendium Spelljammer Appendix, Monstrous Compendium Greyhawk Appendix, Monstrous Compendium Dragonlance Appendix, Greyhawk Ruins, Touch of Death, Monstrous Compendium Forgotten Realms Appendix 2, Goblins Return, Dark Lords, Unsung Heroes, From the Shadows, Forbidden Lore, Van Richten's Guide to Werebeasts. Do you ever used to listen to Dr. Demento, Bruce?
No, I never did, but I am familiar with him.
One of my favorite songs of his is The Werecow. There's a song about a were, and it goes, moo, moo, moo. I'm the werecow. Anyway, was there a werecow in Van Richten's Guide to Werebeasts?
There was not, although a werebull or were-auroch would have been wonderful, but we didn't think of that.
Yeah. So anyway, that is a tangent. Let's continue going here. House of Strahd, the created Ravenloft campaign setting, 2nd edition, Hour of the Knife, First Quest, Dark Sun Monstrous Compendium Appendix 2, Terrors Beyond Tier, Psionic Artifacts of Athos, and Domains of Dread. And then I don't see it listed in here, but I know you also worked on Gamma World, one of the editions of Gamma World.
Gamma World 4th edition.
Yeah, so which there's a really interesting discussion in there about armor class that I want to get into. And then in 1995, Nesmith moved into the computer game field, contributing to the Elder Scrolls II Daggerfall role-playing game, Terminator computer games. He became a senior designer for Bethesda Game Studios, where he worked extensively on the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, its expansion, The Shivering Isles. He also worked on Fallout 3 as a guest writer. Now, I'm sure there's some other stuff, but that's a lot. I mean, that is a great biography. Was there anything you wanted to add to that?
You probably missed my most current signature product, which would be the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. For which I was grateful to be given the task of being the lead designer.
Oh, you were the lead designer on Skyrim.
Correct.
That's no small thing.
That's my number one credit. So
I can't believe. Yeah, this needs to. This Wikipedia entry definitely needs to be updated. So that's a major credit. So there, as I said before, there's so much stuff I could get into that is of interest personally to me, and I know to my listeners. But before we keep going, tell us a little bit. You've now jumped into the world of novel writing. and you've got a novel out, and I think you're working on the sequel, but you've got a novel out called Mischief Maker. Tell us a little bit about Mischief Maker.
Mischief Maker is probably best described as an urban fantasy book. It features the Norse god Loki, who is currently working as a stage magician in the suburbs of Chicago. And someone makes an attempt on his life, and he has to go back into the 9 realms and figure out who is doing it, why they want him dead, and of course, as is always the case with these things, end up saving the world. And the sequel to it, Odin's Escape, just went to my editor, so it should be available in the next 6 to 8 weeks, I would imagine.
So, would you describe your Loki, as a reluctant hero?
He is definitely a reluctant hero. He's a little bit of a coward. He doesn't want to get into fights, but sometimes the universe just forces it to happen anyway.
So, and I know that your Loki is not the Marvel Cinematic Universe Loki.
Not even close. I actually did a tremendous amount of research into Norse mythology, and I tried to keep very close to that source material. And one of the premises is that Loki wasn't quite the bad guy everyone paints him to be, because he suffers from the old adage of the victors write the history, and he was not the victor at Ragnarok, and so he didn't get to write the histories.
Yeah, my most recent, I don't even know if I'd call it a deep dive with Loki, the mythological Loki. Not, I mean, I enjoyed him in the MCU, and I enjoyed his series on Disney Plus. But that's a whole different take on the character.
Absolutely.
I wasn't that long ago, the past 2 or 3 years, I listened to Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology book, where he writes the Norse mythology as if it's fiction, as if it's prose, but he tries to somewhat stick to the original mythology. And what struck me about the Loki of his stuff was that Loki was super clever and could pull everybody's fat out of the fire, but he was also usually the person that got everybody's fat into the fire to begin with. So that was kind of the Loki of his version. And then, of course, towards the end, they all get tired of him and they catch him and put him in that eternal torment, like in the cave or whatever. So your Loki, would you say that's a fair characterization, that he's spending all of his time getting himself out of the trouble he got himself into? Or is that yet more of kind of like the victor rights?
Well, he's definitely a trickster.
Okay.
So he gets into trouble and then has to get himself out of trouble, and he gets other people in trouble and has to get them out of trouble. So that part definitely matches. But part of what I did was I took the character of Thor and had him be more the school bully who ends up getting in trouble, and Loki has to save him, but ultimately Loki gets blamed for Thor getting in trouble.
Of course.
All of that's ancient history by the time my story takes place.
So did you see, like, as you were doing your research into Norse mythology, did you see like echoes of that? Or was that more of your take on the character? Or did you say, no, Loki was actually kind of done wrong here?
That's more my take on the character. If you look into the actual mythology, you can divide it into 2 parts. The early days, where Loki is actually a companion to Thor, and while not necessarily seen as his equal, seen as a valued sidekick, and frequently is considered to be one of the good guys. Even though he does bad things occasionally, he always makes up for it. But he's seen as an equal partner to the other Norse gods in a lot of ways. And then all of a sudden, Balder gets killed. And for no reason whatsoever that the Norse myths are willing to explain, Loki is guilty of killing Balder. And at that point, everything gets flipped on its head, and Loki becomes the bad guy. They hunt him down and they punish him. And then when he escapes, he brings the giants in to destroy Asgard. So he kind of has these 2 lives. One where he's Robin to Thor's Batman, and then later where he's the villain who destroys the world.
You've done a lot of writing in your career for games, and again, I'm going to touch on a lot of things that came up in your interview with me and Steve Talk RPGs, but I'm trying to take it a different direction. I'd like people to think of this as more of a companion podcast episode, and I really recommend people go listen to that. But you got into one of the more quote unquote creative aspects of game design is the dialogue. Going from decades of game design and game writing, dialogue writing, this, that, and the other, quest writing, whatever, was it hard to shift yourself mentally into doing pure prose?
Not as hard as I thought it would be. And I suspect that all my years doing writing of various sorts helped that tremendously. But the primary difference really is the dialogue is the same. And all my years of writing dialogue for video games definitely paid off. But you don't write narration for video games. You don't describe the scene. The scene is whatever is on the screen. It's literally portrayed visually, which is obviously a superior way to do things. And I had to learn how to write that part well. So the dialogue came very naturally. I struggled a little bit with the narration, but from my years at TSR, I also had some narration experience, so I was able to draw on that to bring it forward. But that's really the main differences involved in that.
And but did you find it? I guess if you're developing for an RPG or a video game or something, it's a group project. If you're writing, other than like maybe your editor or some beta readers or something, it's I would imagine it's much more solitary. Was that kind of hard to adjust to?
Yes and no. It is much more solitary. And the deadlines were ones that I had to impose upon myself as opposed to ones that some outside agency, i.e. my boss or the company, would impose on me. But even when I was working at Bethesda, you might have a huge game where lots of people are working together, but you have your own quest and you are the owner of that quest and you write everything for it. And then it gets passed off to other people to look at, and they make comments and they give you feedback, and then you make changes accordingly. And I didn't have quite as strong a group of people to help me do that on the novel. So that was a big difference. But there's still enough ownership when you do a story in a video game that you can relate that experience to having to write the novel.
Good luck with your novel writing career. I like to do creative writing. I've done short stories, I've done novellas. A novel that's an accomplishment. And then to take it even further and to get it published is, congratulations. So, and you got a second one on the way. So folks, check out the link. I'll put a link to Amazon in the show notes at shaneplays.com. It's Mischief Maker by Bruce Nesmith. And it stars everyone's favorite trickster, Loki. But Bruce, and I know that this comes up a lot, talking about mythology or archetypes in storytelling. What is it about the trickster that everyone loves so much?
Everybody loves an anti-hero. There's a fantasy that you can get away with doing bad things. And the trickster and the anti-hero plays into that. I get to do bad things and get away with it. I think the other thing about a trickster that's appealing is he's the smart guy. If you look at Thor is not a very interesting character. He's just brute force. But a character like Loki is a smart character. He outwits people. He does things that are interesting as a result. So he makes a much more compelling centerpiece for a story than Thor does. Thor's solution to everything is, I'm going to hit it with my hammer.
Right. And honestly, tricksters are more fun. They're going to get you into trouble, but you're probably going to have more fun along the way. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's great. So I hope that your stuff goes well, and I look forward to getting my hands on Mischief Maker and checking it out. I've always been a Loki fan, even in the MCU. Again, that's not really the mythological Loki, but they gave him a redemption arc, which I liked a lot. So, yeah. So anyway, all right, moving on. So again, this is so hard to even know where to start, but I've got a few questions written down here to help keep me focused. I want to start with this. Okay, so you started with TSR back in 1981. And you will, again, people go listen to the Me and Steve Talk RPGs podcast with Bruce, because he relates this really fascinating story of how he got hired. And he said, this never happens, but it happened to me. Because he had developed a computer game based on Dungeons and Dragons while working over the summer at his college. TSR caught wind of it up and offered him a job doing video games based on D&D. But for the full thing on that, go listen to the other podcasts that I'll link. But what I want to ask you is the name of that was Dungeon.
Correct.
And I'm like,
Dragons. The name of that was Dragons.
Oh, the name was Dragons. Okay.
Yes, I may have said it was Dungeon in the other podcast.
Okay.
That's wrong.
Well, that's what I was looking, because like that perked my ears, because there was another dungeon that showed up on a mainframe, and I didn't know if maybe there was some cross pollination there, but it was called Dragons, and it was a big hit at your university. So tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, this was in the days of ASCII art. So the idea was that you had a big dungeon. It was 10 levels deep, and you would see the dungeon with walls that were made with pound signs, and periods were open spaces. Doors were brackets. The monsters were numbers, and you were a symbol with a less than or a greater than, and then whatever first initial you chose in the center. And that's the level of the graphics. One thing that I did do that was kind of fun was it had an actual ray tracing for what you could see. And ray tracing makes it sound like it was really complicated, but when you're dealing with something 2D and specific location based like that was, it's not as hard as it sounds. But it literally would be whatever you'd be able to see from that location was printed and nothing else was visible.
Now, when you say printed, was this one of the games or the output? Was this actually printing on paper, or was there a screen?
Well, with the computer system that they purchased, the HP 3000, they had just gotten CRT screens.
Okay.
Which would run, at a whopping, what was it? I want to say 300 baud. They were ridiculously slow by today's standards. So every time you moved a space, you could obviously only move up, down, left, right, and at the angles, it would redraw everything that you could see. And so you'd have this, long list of what you could see going up off the screen for as far as you could scroll back to look at it if you wanted. So I imagine there were a few people who played it on paper terminals, but if they did, they wasted a tremendous amount.
Yeah, a lot of paper. Yeah, that's crazy. So, and you said it was you developed several games.
Yeah.
But this was the hit. This was the big one.
This was the big one. And as I said in the other podcast as well, when everybody came back in the fall, my games were the only games that were available because it was a brand spanking new computer system. So while I think some of the games I did were very appealing and were popular on their own merit, a lot of it also had to do with the fact that those were the only things you could play. That was it. There was nothing else.
Well, even with that, I mean, if you made, I'm just throwing a number out, if you made 5 games and everybody's spending most of their time playing Dragons, I think that, shows that Dragons was the fun one or the most fun or something. I don't know. What were the other ones that you made? Like, can you remember what they were about?
There was one that was a very interesting game called Chase. And it basically, you started in one corner of a grid and a robot started in the other corner. And then there were various walls that were randomly seated around. and you had to get to a destination location that was randomly chosen. And the robot could move 2 spaces every turn, and you could only move 1. So you had to, but its AI was very primitive. It always moved straight towards you. So you had to try to move in such a way to get it trapped behind the walls to get around and get away from it.
And this was, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, and then to add some interest to it, you could set a number of teleport markers if you wanted that were marked as where they were, but not marked to where they connected. So you'd enter one of them, and it would be like an asterisk on the screen, and you would suddenly appear at a remote location, and then it would replace those asterisks with numbers. So it was, number 2 goes to number 2, and so you could also use those to try to escape the robot.
Were you surprised that out of the games that you put together that Dragons was the most popular?
I was not surprised. I had put way more effort into it. It was a lot more interesting gameplay, and I was probably surprised by the popularity of it, but not that it was the most popular of the games that I made.
It sounds to me like you were already a Dungeons & Dragons fan, and you made the game because of that. Is that correct?
That is correct. I was introduced to D&D in high school. I was I want to say a junior at the time. A little fuzzy on the memory there. But a friend of mine's older brother was in college, and he brought it home, and he had the old white box set.
Mm-hmm.
And he introduced us to that. And it's one of those, I imagine everybody has these moments when they first play Dungeons & Dragons, but it's one of these eye-opening experiences where you never even considered that a game could be this. You're used to, and for me, it's much more primitive wargame experiences because back then they didn't have as all the cool stuff we have now. But, I'm playing Parcheesi and chess and Othello and games like that. And all of a sudden, I played Evening of Dungeons & Dragons, and it's like, this is completely changing my world. It's completely and utterly different from anything I've ever even thought of experiencing before.
Yeah, it's like you have those moments where you're like, something resonates with you so deeply. You're like, how lucky am I that this even exists? That, like if I was born 100 years ago, I would have missed out on this kind of thing. So you became a fan based on the original white box D&D. And then, you were at school, and I believe you were studying mathematics, correct?
Correct. I went to Beloit College, and there I started off in physics and chemistry and math, and found out that I'm decent at physics, but not good enough, and that I'm really bad at chemistry. So I ended up getting the math degree because it turns out I was pretty good at math. And in the process, I was running a homegrown campaign, D&D campaign for some friends, homegrown rules and everything, because I didn't even know where to buy the rule set. So,
So you just made it up based on what you remembered of playing?
Yep, just made it up. It was a 2d20 system where you roll 2 20-sided die to attack, and made up all my own creatures. And because I didn't have any polyhedral dice, we were literally rolling multiple d6s and using them to simulate what the 20-sided dice would be like. It was horribly painful.
But also fun. I mean, I don't know, there's a part of me that loves that kind of thing. Like I love the, let's roll these dice and make them work. And how do we simulate that with these dice? So, do any of these, does any of your old computer code or any of your old rules from these, from your homegrown D&D game, does any of that still exist?
The friend of mine and I who developed it, and he did more of the work than I did in high school, he still got all of that, and he still actually runs that same homegrown rule set. He never got into the official D&D stuff, but he still runs an occasional campaign with that and still plays it. I haven't played that rule set in 30 years or more at this point. As for the computer stuff, I was contacted about 5 years ago by somebody in the Hewlett Packard historical users group. I'm sure I'm getting that wrong, but it's a group that preserves software written on Hewlett Packard computers. And there's these user groups all across the country for different computer systems that do this. And they came across an old mag tape that had my game on it. And he sent it to me. And he sent it to me with an HP 3000 operating system simulator. So I was actually able to crank up that game and play it on my PC for a little while.
How kind was that of them to do that for you?
That was spectacular. I mean, it was very surreal to see the title screen come up with my name underneath it, even before I had moved a single space on the track.
So what was the experience like playing it again? Were you like, this is wonderful? Or you were like, well, now that I've got all these decades of design under me, were you just seeing it from a designer's standpoint? Or
there was a lot of nostalgia involved in it. The game obviously does not stand up to even the most primitive of MUDs that are still going around today or even 20 years ago. But the nostalgia factor for me, seeing my old work and remembering, oh, geez, I really did do that. That's kind of cool. It's hard to beat that. It's reliving the glory days, like Bruce Springsteen sang about.
Yeah. Well, your hard work that summer resulted in you getting a call out of the blue from TSR saying, "Hey, a job? That's crazy."
It did.
Nobody ever gets a lightning bolt out of the blue like that. So that's such a great thing to have happen. Just to give people the cliff notes, TSR, who wanted to make video games, caught wind of your game and called you out of the blue.
Offered me a job, and I never even contacted them. And as I say at the end of that story, no one should ever wait around for someone to offer them their ideal job, because it can't happen to you because it happened to me. I'm the only person it can ever happen to now.
Yeah. You've used up that bit of luck or that critical role or whatever in the universe. That was
my critical hit. That was my natural 20.
Yeah. Crazy. So speaking of natural 20s, do you remember how when you were simulating a D20 with D6s, do you remember numerically how that worked?
Oh, yeah. You'd roll one 6-sided die to determine 1 through 4. You had to re-roll the 5s and 6s. And that would determine which set of 5, 1 to 5, 6 to 10, 11 to 15, or 16 to 20 you were in. And then the second die, you'd only pay attention to 1 through 5, and you'd re-roll the 6. And then that would give you your full D20. So basically, you were rolling those 2 dice, and it was rare you didn't have to re-roll at least one of them. And frequently, you'd re-roll a few times. So, and given that there were 2 20-sided die, you had to do that twice.
But it works.
It does.
Right. So
mathematically, it worked. It was painful, but it's one of the things that also let me know that this is something that engages a lot of different people's imagination, because they put up with that in order to play this game. And in those days, it was pure dungeon crawl. I mean, D&D in the late 70s was all dungeon crawl. There wasn't any big stories. There were no master villains. It was just, you start off at the entrance to a dungeon, and you go through and you beat up creatures and come back with loot and buy better equipment and go back in and do it all over again. That was the whole thing.
Which is right. And that's an important point, because the roots of tabletop role-playing are so heavily influenced by Dungeons & Dragons, and Dungeons & Dragons is so heavily influenced by that concept. A lot of people that are coming into the hobby these days, and you have a wonderful discussion on the other podcast with me and Steve, Talk RPGs, talking about how you think that iterating and people coming along later and enhancing and iterating on the designs and that sort of thing is a wonderful thing. I really enjoyed that part of the discussion. But people are coming in and going, well, why is the game like this? or why are characters like that? So much of it is because it started as a kick down the doors dungeon crawl, and that's why D&D is still so heavily combat oriented. It's one of the major pillars of D&D. Even though it's a role playing game, ROLE, there is role playing in it, but I mean, it really came out of a combat heavy background.
Well, if you go back far enough, Gygax and his crew, they were playing war games. They were doing miniatures games in sandbox tables, and they were doing war games on. I don't know if they were doing Hex Encounter, but they were doing that style of war game as well. And so for them, it was just all about war and combat. And then one day, somebody, it wasn't Gary, it was his companion, who said, "Well, I'm going to give this guy a personality, and he's going to have special attributes." And that opened that door to what it means to be a character who has special powers, a hero.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot of different things in the history of D&D. It's one of my. I'm a armchair scholar, love going into it, but one of the major leaps in game design or whatever, and it may not seem like a big deal now, but at the time it was huge, to go from a miniature or a piece represents an individual and not a unit of 5 individuals or 100 individuals or an army or something. That was a huge leap. In the chain that led us to what role playing games are now. So when it comes to your math background, do you feel that was a? Oh, and I wanted to add before I forget, when you were programming this original game that led you into the game industry, getting that job invite, I think, did you say you were working in COBOL?
Well, I was programming in COBOL to create the new accounting system for the college. And that was my 9 to 5. And then I'd spend another 8 hours doing my game, and that was done in BASIC.
Okay. So whatever the BASIC was on that HP 3000.
Yeah, they had their own special version of BASIC, which was slightly better than the original BASIC, but not a lot. It still used line numbers, for example.
Line numbers, okay. I mean, yeah, I learned on line numbers back in the day.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I'm still super comfortable in BASIC. I love BASIC, actually. I mean, it has a lot of flaws, but it did what it was supposed to do, which was to make it easier for people to program.
Yeah.
So anyway, all right. So moving on. So you made it to TSR. They offered you a job. You said, "Let me think about it." Yes, sounds like you were excited for it.
Oh, yeah.
So, and they hired you to do. Now, the Wikipedia entry says they hired you to do games on the Apple II Plus. Was that the only platform they were developing for, and what games were they trying to do when they brought you in?
Well, actually, when they first brought me in, and actually, I can give you a story I did not give the Steves of my interview and my first day. So I'll fold that in and then answer your question directly. When I went to my interview, I was totally raw, right out of college. I'd never been to an interview. I didn't know what to expect. And they sat me in the corner of a room for the vice president of sales and marketing, Will Niebling. And they had arrayed around me, I want to say it was 8 chairs with various people, including the director of IT, the managers that I'd end up being reporting to. And I'm sitting on this little folding table in the corner, and they're all in a semicircle in front of me, shooting questions at me.
Wow. That's that's much more aggressive and corporate than I would have expected for 1981 TSR.
Well, I mean, TSR was trying to be corporate. They were struggling to succeed, but they were trying. And I didn't know any better. I just thought this is how interviews were supposed to go. So, I'm sitting there answering their questions and doing the best I can. And, they ended up offering me the job. And then my first day on the job, I showed up in a suit because I didn't know any better. And the standard clothing, office wear at TSR in those days was ragged jeans, tennis shoes with holes in them, and dirty T-shirts.
Hold on. So how long did it take you to live that down?
Years. It took a long time to live that down. Long time to live that down.
How were they dressed when you were at your interview? Were they all in suits when they were interviewing you?
Well, I was interviewed by, I think it was like 3 VPs as
Right.
well as some middle and lower level managers. So there were all levels of dress there.
Right.
But I took the better safe than sorry approach when I put my suit on for my first day at work.
And you walked in and everyone's like, who's this new executive?
No, my suit didn't fit well enough for that.
Okay.
But so the building at the time was in downtown Lake Geneva, and it was a building that was in danger of being condemned. And in fact, about 10 years
I think
later,
I've heard about this building, actually.
yeah. And in fact, it actually was condemned about 10 years later. So I go in, and this building it's a wreck. It's a former hotel that they had turned into an apartment building. And now all the little offices, I mean, you could see like the closets and stuff like that. It was a very surreal experience. There was an actual kink in the hallway. It took a little bit of a jog to the right. If you were to lay a round pencil on the floor, it would actually roll towards one side or the other because the floors weren't level. And so I go into this room. I'm in my suit, and Mike Price is there. And Mike is a really sweet guy. He's a great guy. He's an artist now, and he's doing really fabulously well at that. But he was my boss, and he had shaggy long hair down well past his shoulders and a scraggly beard. And he was dressed like I said. I don't remember the specific clothes, but he was very dressed down would be an understatement. And we're in this little teeny room, which it was maybe 10 by 10. And the entire walls all around had Post-it notes on them with little sayings from the police de chat and the Mouse Gestapo. Apparently, Mike had had a dream the week before that he had told all his friends, and they came in over the weekend and covered the walls with these Post-its. I mean, there were hundreds of these little Post-its. And so here I am, fresh out of college, as green could be, walk in, I'm way out of place, and I sit down, and there's all these Post-its all over the walls. And my first task was to work on a TRS-80 Radio Shack computer on a program that was stored on paper tape. And it was a Le Mans 24. 24 is a Le Mans game, which one of the big principals at TSR was a huge fan of that. So we wanted to make a computer game out of it.
And so you say Le Mans? Like,
Le Mans.
I mean,
LEMANS.
Le Mans, like the 24-hour endurance race.
Yeah, it's a 24-hour endurance. Yeah,
right.
So he wanted to do a gaming simulation of that, and he had written a lot of it. But the problem he was having is that every turn, it was taking forever to print up the 53 or whatever it was cars, the current order. And so they wanted me to fix that. That was my very first task. So I did the world's simplest programming stunt and wrote a modified bubble sort. And because one of the attributes of a bubble sort is that it always takes the first place and puts it up at the top, and that's its first action, I just printed stuff as it bubbled up. And they were really impressed with the fact that now it was printing stuff out quickly. And I was just kind of shaking my head inside because this is like the simplest, most rote programming task you could come up with.
Right. But well, to you though, right? Because you got that program. I mean, you probably learned, who knows how much you learned just programming those games over that summer and having to solve those problems. So tell us a little bit more about these yellow stickies. They were from what sources again?
There's a French graphic novel series called The Mouse Gestapo.
Okay.
And it features, obviously, is satire, black satire about World War II and the Holocaust. But it features two principal groups, the Mouse Gestapo and the Police de Chat. And that is the cat police in French. And I'm sure I'm butchering the French pronunciation because I do not speak French. But Mike Price spoke French, and he was reading it in its original French. And so there's all these things like, the Mouse Gestapo is watching you. The police to shot have your number. All this kind of stuff, all with these dark twists, all printed with little drawings of, mice and Gestapo hats and cats in police uniforms done by the art department. And, I look up from the TRS-80 and there's like 40 of them on the wall in front.
With all these like grim.
Yes.
You're like, where have I gotten a job?
Surreal doesn't even begin to explain it.
You're like, I better not mess up. They're watching.
Yeah, and here I am sitting in my suit.
Yeah. So what did you remember what you wore the next day?
Oh, I came in jeans and a t-shirt for the next day.
Yeah.
So I got with the dress code pretty quickly. I quite literally, that was the only suit I owned. So
you're like, okay, thank goodness I don't have to wear that every day. Well, I mean, because a lot of people I understand in the early '80s, that still would have been kind of the dress code at some companies.
Most companies.
That just shows you, the culture of TSR in the early '80s. That people were just dressing and getting the job done like that. So it was probably a very fun atmosphere to work in. Now, so when you were working on the TRS-80 and fixing that stuff, like, do you remember what other games they had? They were trying to, because I do not remember TSR putting out any like non like D&D related, or you know what I'm saying? So the fact that they were working on racing games or whatever kind of surprises me. Do you remember any other kind of titles you were working on in the early days?
The racing game never saw the light of day. None of the TRS-80 games did. But shortly after they reformulated that department, Mike Price moved into, I want to say he was one of the writers. I'm not 100% sure on that, but I'm about 80% sure. And they moved us into the new building down on Sheridan Springs Road. And from that building, they decided to have a pair of programmers, and Mike was out, so I got to be the boss, quote unquote. And I hired a programmer named Keith Engie, who was brilliant. He wrote in assembly language. And Steve Sullivan was our artist, and he did the art for it. And we did 3 games for the Apple II Plus. And one of them was the Dungeon board game, which was a staple at TSR for a while, young children's games. And I did that game. The Dawn Patrol, which was a real-time flight simulator, wireframe with an actual valid horizon and probably 20 different biplanes with proper line art views out the cockpit of them. But it was also running at a frame rate of about 5 to 8. So, 5 to 8 frames per second. You literally watched it redraw.
Oh, wow.
But that was Keith's thing, because that needed to have the speed of assembly language to get that to operate properly. And while I was good at math, he was way better at the 3D math than I was. And the third game was Theseus and the Minotaur, which was my game. And that was another 3D maze game with line drawing, first-person perspective. And you were wandered through a maze, and you had to avoid the Minotaur, the Minotaur's wife, and the Minotaur's baby, or son, while finding things like a sword or other things that would help you. And you had to try and get your way out of this 3-level maze. And those are the 3 games we made, and they actually did print them and did sell them. And, tens of people bought those. Tens of people, I tell you.
Well, I'm actually reading here on the CRPG Addict, and he said that he's like, TSR made a brief foray into games and published Dungeon computer adventure game, Theseus and the Minotaur, and Dawn Patrol. So were those the only 3 that actually got published while you were there?
Yep, those are the only 3. And when TSR realized they had no idea how to market these, they scrubbed the entire department because they were used to printing. They were used to making a printed product, giving it to Random House, and then Random House would sell it. And Random House looked at these computer games and said, "We don't know how to sell these. Why are we going to take them? We know how to sell books, and your stuff can fit on a bookshelf, so we know how to sell that."
So in business terms, TSR did not have a distribution channel. So for the Dungeon Computer Adventure game, did you ever interact with David McGarry, or was the game already complete enough for what TSR had, that y'all were just working off the board game?
Yeah, the game had been out for years at that point.
So
no, I never had to contact him. So all we had to do was look at all the component pieces and put it all together and recreate that in an Apple II Plus platform. And that was a good game. I mean, we did that well. I mean, obviously we didn't design the game. It was the board game, pure and simple, but it played well and it was fun. And, I was probably, of the two that I did, that was definitely the better effort.
So it's a shame that, the marketing channel or whatever you want to call it wasn't there, because TSR could have expanded their, operations. A lot of people think of TSR as, Dungeons and Dragons and Star Frontiers and, Gamma World and Boot Hill, all these games. And they did make those games, but TSR was always putting out, all kinds of other stuff too. It's obvious to me that once it outgrew just Gary Gygax basically, and his initial folks he was working with, it, there was an effort for TSR to just be a games company in general.
Yes.
And so I think a lot of people don't realize that with TSR. They so associate it with Dungeons and Dragons, which of course was its most magnificently successful product. But TSR was not just sitting around, riding on the coattails of D&D. They were trying to be a game company in general. So it's fascinating stuff to look at if you go down the history of everything that they put out. So, which leads me, and I am not looking for negative stuff or dirt. So this is not my kind of podcast. I'm not 2020. But I am curious. You were there in 81 and you were there through, I think you said 95.
Right.
So you were there for several years while Gary Gygax was still there. And then I believe in 86 is whenever, depending on whose version you listen to, he left or was forced out or whatever. And then there were some tough years financially while they were trying to, turn things around or whatever. So what was it like for you to come in 81, which I would imagine is still sort of TSR is kind of riding high somewhat. It's still kind of a young company, so it's still fun and crazy. And then you were there through 95. So what was it like for you in those different eras of TSR?
Well, interestingly, I actually left the industry for about 4 years in the middle of that.
Oh, did you? Okay.
So I started in 81, and then I'm going to give approximate dates for this because it's been so long. I left in 85 and came back in 90. I want to say that's about right.
Okay. Were you there?
The joke was it was 4 years, 4 years, 4 years. That I was like, every time I was someplace for 4 years, I switched. Went someplace new. And those numbers don't quite add up to 4 years, but that's roughly what it was.
So were you there when Gary left, or had you already left? Okay.
Well, I was still in Lake Geneva, and I was not there when Gary left, but I was there during the tough times. In fact, I left in the fourth wave of layoffs. And my departure is something that I think my wife forgave me for about 5 years ago, maybe. Maybe she hasn't forgiven me yet at all, totally. But our boss, Harold Johnson, came to the group of designers, because this is the fourth round of layoffs, and said, hey, I'm told I have to lay one of you off, and I don't know what to do. And so I said, you can lay me off, Harold. I will volunteer. This is what my wife has not forgiven me for.
Right. So you
And
didn't come home and say, I got bad news, honey. I got
yeah,
fired. You told
I
her.
volunteered to lose my job. But I also knew of all the people there with my computer background, I could get another job. And
Right.
then they would struggle to get another job. And things weren't going well there. I mean, it was not going to be a positive place to be because, this is the fourth round of layoffs. 2 weeks later, I had a job working at a company that, interestingly, their initials were GBS. Working at, they did high-end presentation systems for Fortune 500 companies. So I was still doing programming, still heavily involved in computers. And I did writing on the side for TSR during those 4 years. Doing various some of the products that you mentioned, like the monster manuals. I did entries for those as to make extra money during those years. And
So
during
you
those,
sort of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, during those years is when Lorraine Williams bought the company from Gary.
Like I said, I'm not here to do dirt. A lot of people are like kind of down on Lorraine Williams. Sometimes I look at it and I go, well, I mean, there was financial straits, and what do you do? So I try to give her the benefit of a doubt that she was sitting there looking at all the financials and trying to keep the company afloat. But there's other people that were there that may have different opinions. That's one rabbit hole I haven't gone down too far. The closest I've come to that is there's are you familiar with John Peterson?
Yeah, the name rings a bell.
He writes very scholarly, well researched history books on the history of role playing games. And he recently came out with a book called Game Wizards, which goes into a very scholarly, well researched portrayal of those years, down to the numbers and the finances and all that stuff. But anyway, so you were contracting or freelancing during that time and doing some extra work.
Yeah, and then the place I was working at went through tough times. And so I left there, and Jim Ward was gracious enough to rehire me back at TSR. And the next 4 years, I would say, were probably one of the glory periods of the company. That's when second edition was in its ascendancy, and there was a huge proliferation of campaign worlds. That's when Lorraine Williams, and she had pluses or minuses just like Gary did, but she brought the company to a professional standard that the previous administrations were struggling to get them to.
Well, and that's the thing, looking at history and taking emotion out of it, which, like John Peterson is good at that. You had the first phase of TSR, the first glory days or whatever, you had gamers who ended up running a company.
Correct. And then they did not know what they were doing largely. I mean, the chief operating officer was a former pharmacist. The president, Gary, was a former shoe salesman and insurance salesman, or shoe repairman and insurance salesman. You could just go down the line. Everybody had done something that was not that.
Right. They'd all just come together for their love of gaming, and suddenly D&D took off like a rocket, and they were trying to hold on. I mean, that's kind of one way of looking at it. But then later phases of TSR, you had executives that weren't gamers who were running a company, and gaming was the product. So that led, so the early 90s, you would say, was kind of a second glory days. You had second edition, you had, all these settings coming out. I want to kind of, and am I characterizing that right? I want to make sure I'm not accidentally mischaracterizing what you're saying.
I would actually say that was the glory days. There was the first
glory days.
Oh my God, we've actually got a hit on our hands. That was first edition AD&D when Gary was still there. But if you compare the number of products, the number of products sold, the money that was made, the early 90s eclipses what was happening in the early 80s.
So for cultural cachet, that when Gary was there was the big boom, but for actually running a successful, profitable company, you're saying the early '90s was really the boom.
More hearts and minds were affected by the early '90s by far than the early '80s, in my opinion.
All right, no, that's fascinating. It's one of the reasons why I like to talk to people that were there. So I want to kind of go back and I want to camp out on Jim Ward for a second. So you had a lot of nice things to say about Jim Ward on the Me and Steve Talk RPGs podcast. So Jim Ward, if I remember right, not only wrote Metamorphosis Alpha, which is considered as one of the first, if not the first, science fiction role playing games, but he also wrote Gamma World. And you said something very interesting. Did I hear right that Jim Ward said at one point that Gamma World was actually the second RPG ever written?
That's what he said.
Okay.
I hope I'm remembering that right. I hope I'm quoting him correctly. If I'm not, my apologies, Jim. But that's my understanding. And Gamma World is basically a retooling of Metamorphosis Alpha. It's the same game that MA takes place on a Sentry ship that's in space, and Gamma World takes place on Earth. But it's the same basic concept, the same rule set, the same characters, etc.
Well, it's the same setting, if I understand right. It's just
Well, one of them's on a ship, a spaceship, and the other's on.
I guess same universe. I guess I would say, yeah, same universe. So Gamma World is like, and this is a very rough analogy. The first edition of Gamma World is basically D&D, but with mutants. I mean, I believe it's like a futuristic apocalypse with mutants.
But it also emphasized wildness and humor in a way that you did not see in D&D.
Gotcha. All right. Well, and Gamma World is, very well remembered. It's still played. And now you worked on the fourth edition.
Gamma World that's a setting that I've always had a soft spot for. I always liked its crazy insanity and the fact that your character was something really wild and creative. Those always really appealed to me a lot. And so I was very, very happy when I got the fourth edition assignment, even though a lot of people didn't consider it a plum assignment because Gamma World was not one of the products that was, hugely popular at that time compared to things like Al-Qadim and Spelljammer and stuff like that.
Now, you did something, to me, it's very interesting while you worked on fourth edition. And you, as in your own words, you attacked the negative armor class system. I'm gonna take us back for a second to make a point, and then I'll bring us back to this. You were talking about in the early days, you're like, I didn't have the D&D rules, so I made it up the best I could remember. And, having these crazy, trying to do D20s with D6s kind of added to the investment of it, because I had to invest in that and it made me engage with the game more. So when I was first introduced to D&D and role-playing games and all that, the oddness or difficulty or challenge of learning the rules and the dice and everything, to me, was part of the mystique. So it was like, this is my thing, right? This is my thing. And so it was part of the mystique for me. Now, these days I could care less, right? Give me a crunchy rule set, give me an easy rule set, whatever. I'm going to have fun either way. But at the time, having that, you got to roll high or low, but the armor class goes down, and the lower the armor class, the harder you are to hit, and but your levels go up and all this. And a lot of people complain about that in retrospect, but it never bothered me. And in fact, I kind of liked that, to be quite honest. But while you were doing 4E for Gamma World, you said that you attacked that, and you basically came up with what they use now, which is armor class goes up, starts at 10, rolling higher is always better, and which is basically kind of how it's done now. Yeah. So was it the gamer you or the mathematician you that did not like the negative armor classes?
It was probably 60-40 the mathematician. Everybody at TSR disliked the negative armor class, but it wasn't something we could change. I mean, and it wasn't something I would have recommended that they change in the middle and midstream. And so nobody bothered to sit around and try and figure out how to do it better. But here I had, this little side project in Gamma World, which was, seen as the ugly redheaded child, and I could do whatever I wanted, and no one was going to complain. And Jim Ward, bless his soul, gave me permission to redo it, because if he had had his way, he would have just kept the D&D rules.
Right.
He said, "No, go ahead. Let's try to see."
Now, do you remember? Was it supposed to be that, like, if you can play second edition D&D, the rules are the same in 4E Gamma World? Did they want it like that? So, because like for third edition, with the D20 system, they wanted the games to be as similar as possible. So, like, you're like, oh, well, if I know how to play D&D third edition, then I can play the Star Wars RPG because it's basically the same. Was it like that?
Basically, yeah. I mean, they had this, elephant in the room, 800-pound gorilla, choose your metaphor. And in order to lower the barrier to entry, it was, let's use the same thing. Let's use the same basic system. And as designers, we rebelled against that, not because it didn't make sense, but because we wanted to stretch our legs and stretch our minds, and we wanted to do new and cool things. We wanted to come up with new systems. And the other thing to remember that helped us win some of these battles is this was an era in which many new role-playing games were being generated. Probably more than today, I would say, but definitely definitely at least in the same ballpark. And everybody was trying something new. Everybody was using dice in a different way, using storytelling in a different way, coming up with a different campaign background. And there were just everybody was trying stuff, and some of it stuck and some of it didn't. And so when we wanted to try something, and in my case, it would be for Gamma World, we kind of had that argument in our back pocket. It says, look what these other companies are doing. Let's give it a shot. Like I said, Jim Ward was willing to let me try that, and what I came up with by sheer coincidence is the same system that D&D 5e uses currently for attack rolls and armor classes. And I don't think they saw the work I did and copied it. I think it was just parallel development. They did a thing that was smart, and I happened to do a thing that was smart also. And they actually did it better than I did back then. They included some other stuff in there that definitely is significantly better than the stuff I had. Their advantage and disadvantage system was not something I thought of, and I think that's just a brilliant way to do things.
So when you did that, and the game was published or whatever, did you get any feedback on that mechanic specifically, either from outside or inside the company?
I did get some feedback. Definitely more negative than positive. People who played D&D and were so used to that system were confused. They struggled to invert their thinking to work properly for this, and it actually was a bit of a barrier to entry. So, from that point of view, it wasn't a success. But those people who stuck with it or were a little more open-minded, they loved it because it made life so much easier mathematically. They didn't have to go through all kinds of weird mathematical hoops to figure out what they were trying to accomplish.
Back in the day, Bruce, I mean, people forget you had to have a separate chart for each class's two hit table.
Oh, yeah.
Like if I'm a fighter, I've got to look up on this chart to see if I'm a fighter and at this level and I want to hit somebody that has a 2 armor class, I have to look at a chart. So
math for it. You had to go look it up.
So I agree that for new players and for easier adoption and everything that, having the positive armor classes and all that, makes more sense. But my, what you imprint on when you start playing is special to you, right? Usually. So I imprinted on that older way of doing things. So Yeah, I want to kind of jump back a little bit. You were saying that in TSR that there was resistance, like the developers, the designers. You were saying pretty much universally disliked the negative armor classes.
Yeah.
Really wasn't going to change anytime soon. What do you think that was basically just because, well, that was Gary's way he did it, so we're not going to change it? Or was there more practical reasons, like we would have to rewrite all this stuff?
No, there's very practical reasons. You have to remember, Gary was not at the company at this point. This was during Lorraine's administration.
That's right. Yeah, because we're talking second edition.
You had something that was working. You had something that your entire audience understood and knew how to deal with. And it wasn't going to actually make an enormous difference. So why upset the apple cart? There wasn't the payoff just wasn't there, and it took D&D going into an eclipse in between third and fourth edition, and needing to be revived and needing fresh blood in order for them to be willing to make the enormous changes they made in 5e. That would never have happened back for second edition. You were taking something that was successful and you're just trying to build on it, and reinventing the wheel. That's not smart business, and it wouldn't have served the players either.
You've shared that you feel that 5e is a wonderful edition.
Mm-hmm.
So what is it about 5e that you like so much?
Mostly because it's simple and approachable. They took a couple of unified principles and they applied them to everything. And so the player doesn't have to look things up. He doesn't have to, okay, what is the mechanic for this? Everything is working off of that D20 system and the advantage and disadvantage. Everything in the game works on that. And that makes the game far more approachable. One of the knocks against 4e was that it was cumbersome and complicated. And 5e is in part a counter reaction to that. Now, 5e is not perfect. I could, probably talk for an hour on exactly what all its flaws are, and I'm sure I wouldn't be alone. There's other professional designers out there who hit things that I didn't even think of.
Well, there's no game system out there that's perfect. It's no such thing. So.
Well, and what you're fighting is the perfect simulation with approachability, ease of mechanics, and letting the dice rolling and the mechanics get out of the way of having fun. And those two things butt heads, they collide in a hard way, and you have to make hard choices. And fourth edition chose to go more for the simulation side. They were more miniatures heavy, and that's what they wanted to do. And it doesn't make it right or wrong. They were making that game for that specific purpose. They were valuing the simulation and the realism more for their audience. And 5e decided, let's value something else instead. And the places where 5e falls down almost universally are, okay, this just doesn't feel right that this is the chance of this happening. For example, the advantage-disadvantage system, which I absolutely adore. I think it's fantastic. But when you start getting to the edge cases, where your two hits, your attack roll values are close to 20 or close to 1, the whole thing breaks down. Everything becomes an advantage. Everything is a success on advantage, or everything is a failure. And that advantage-disadvantage system really only works between 5 and 15. It doesn't work at the edges. But man, it works really well in that sweet spot in the middle.
Yeah, the bell curve, the majority, the majority of the bell curve, it works really well.
Yep.
I mean, I think 5e is there's a number of things that have come together to lead to the current explosion in popularity of D&D.
Oh yeah.
But it certainly didn't hurt that 5e released when it did, because it's a very good edition. I do agree. I'm with you that I think that advantage, disadvantage is a very elegant way of representing. You either have an easier or harder chance of doing this without having to go through and, well, I got this modifier and I got this modifier and I got this modifier and I got this modifier. and I got to add it all up and figure it out. Nope, you just have advantage or disadvantage, or they cancel each other out. And it's so elegant, and like I said, for me personally, I don't mind going up and adding up all the modifiers and this and that and the other. But when you have a mass audience and you're trying to bring in new players, it's beautifully elegant. And you get people that are like, well, D&D didn't come up with advantage, disadvantage. Well, there's not many mechanics that any one thing comes. You all incorporate what's out there, and the fact that the major game of the role-playing game industry went to that is pretty impressive, in my opinion.
Yep.
I think 5e is a great addition. In fact, I think they're going to run into the challenge of 5e is such a good addition, that whenever they get around to trying to come out with another edition, there's probably going to be a lot of resistance to it.
Yeah, if they're smart, they'll do a light touch rather than, completely throw out the whole basket of apples like they did with 4th to 5th.
Well, there's already kind of some rumblings of that there's going to be a not quite an edition, complete edition change, but almost like when they went from 3 to 3.5. Yeah, something like that. So we'll see. All right. Well, I've got to ask, I'm a huge Dragonlance nerd. Massively huge. Now, I know that you've also done Ravenloft up to and including, it sounds like you were pretty involved with the Ravenloft campaign setting for 2nd edition.
I was the writer on that. I was the designer.
You were the designer for the Ravenloft campaign setting 2nd edition. Ravenloft is, again, people have to go back if you weren't there. Ravenloft was a big deal when it came out.
It was the 2nd most popular campaign setting they produced. Only Forgotten Realms outsold it, and it outsold it by quite a bit. But it was the 2nd most popular setting they had.
Well, for D&D at the time, to put out a horror-themed adventure and then setting was big, because up until then, it was basically, for the most part, Tolkien-ish fantasy, for the most part. I'm generalizing. But when Ravenloft came along, that's a big deal. And then that kind of led, to all these other wonderful settings that and themes that TSR and now Wizards of the Coast has explored with Dungeons and Dragons. But I do have to go back now. Before I get off of Ravenloft, is there anything you want to say about that? Because that's a pretty big deal that you were the writer on the 2nd edition campaign setting.
Well, I said at the top of the show that Skyrim is probably my most significant credit. The Ravenloft box set is clearly my 2nd most significant credit. That's the pinnacle of what I did for TSR, just like Skyrim is the pinnacle of what I did for Bethesda. So I'm very proud of the work I did there. Andrea Hayday is credited on the box set as well. She was my editor, but her work was so wonderful and important that we actually gave her a box copy credit as well. And she did a fantastic job with that with me.
Did the Ravenloft campaign setting have any werecows in it?
No, I did not have any werecows.
Shane Van Richten's Guide to Werebeast didn't have werecows, and the Ravenloft campaign setting, get off the werecows, man. I'm sorry. I've got to milk it. All right. So now how did you get that? Talking about plum assignments.
I'd already been doing very well. Jim was seeing me as someone that he could count on. Jim Ward, that is. And when it came time to do Ravenloft, I desperately wanted to do it. I'd always loved the original i6 module by Tracy Hickman, and so I lobbied hard for it. And I don't remember how it ended up me getting it, but I want to say that Jeff Grubb maybe had something else he was on, because he would have been the guy who would have beat me out for it if he had wanted it. I don't know if he was working on Al Qadim at the time or if he had some other. Oh, he was doing the Marvel Comics stuff. He was doing the Marvel role-playing game, so he may have been balls in that. Which is another personal favorite of mine. I loved that Marvel RPG. Well, I'm glad you got to work on Ravenloft. And I think I remember you saying that
I think Jim Ward or somebody came to you and said, you got to put some actual rules in here because you were having so much fun with the writing, the setting.
Yeah. Campaign setting, and there was hardly any rules. And he was like, no, you got to have some rules in here, dude. You got to give them something to do.
Oh, that's cool. So I'm congratulations that you got to do that. All right. So let's talk a little bit about Dragonlance, and then we'll wrap on some of your video game stuff. And there's probably people listening that are like, how can, you got to get into all this video game stuff. And you're actually, hopefully, I know you've reached out to Matt Barton of the Matt Chat, and I sent him a message too. So hopefully before too long, you'll get to talk a little bit more about that with Matt Barton. So this will be the second and hopefully a series of 3 interviews. So Dragonlance, and this also reminds me to ask you, so they shut down the computer game division or whatever, and did you just automatically make the jump to writer, or were they just going to let you go, or okay?
No, they offered me the opportunity to be a part of the writing department, and they offered Keith the opportunity to be in the IT department. He was a pure programmer, whereas I was more of a hybrid.
Gotcha.
So I made the transfer over to writing and learned that writing is hard the hard way.
All right, I've got to ask about Dragonlance because I'm such a Dragonlance nerd. So according to the Wikipedia entry, it says after the original Dragonlance group began, the Dragonlance series design team was later expanded to also include, and there's several big names here we kind of talked about at the beginning of the podcast. Now, at what point of the Dragonlance arc, I guess, if you will, because you had the modules, and then you had the books, like at what point did you get involved with Dragonlance?
Fairly far down the chain. I was one of the also rans for Dragonlance. Tracy Hickman and Margaret Weiss obviously were the principals. Doug Niles played a huge role. And then I was just one of the guys who also wrote some of the module materials. I'm going to hopefully get the number right here, but I want to say it was DL4. But the one where they go into the Dwarven ruins. The geomorphic city was something that I worked on, and I did work on that particular module and one other, which one it is escapes me. So I was a peripheral player on Dragonlance, unfortunately.
But you did work on those original modules that made up the original quote unquote Dragonlance trilogy.
Right, I did. That's the DL4. DL4 Dragons of Despair, maybe?
Yeah, let's
take how many dragons up. I don't remember which.
Yeah, it's all dragons. Yeah. It is hard to overestimate or to overstate how big of a Dragonlance nerd I was. So
it was definitely the second most popular product line, eclipsing Ravenloft when it came out.
It was, yeah. And see, I came in, I mean, I was playing D&D. I love D&D. I came into Dragonlance through the novels. I don't even think when the novels first came out that I realized that they were based on modules. I found that out later. So, but yeah, I've always loved Dragonlance. Now, according to this, DL4 is Dragons of Desolation.
The one where they go into the Dwarven city, that's the one. Regardless of what the number of the name is.
The party must find the doors of the ancient Dwarven kingdom of Thorbarden.
Yep, that's it.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. So what was it? I mean, when you were working, and obviously, you're saying that you weren't the core, it was like Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman and et cetera. But did you get a sense when you were working on Dragonlance that it was either special or going to be special? Or did it just seem like another product?
No, it had the stamp that Tracy was able to put on his products that other people really didn't. He had this sense of story that transcended the the mundane and stereotypical stories that the rest of us tended to tell. If you look at the Ravenloft module, the story that's in there is, it's a classic love story. Nobody was doing love stories for D&D. I mean, come on.
Mm-hmm.
And Dragonlance was the same way. It was all about these set characters who were living out this grand, expansive story. And we'd never done, pre-generated characters that were supposed to be really important before. They were always an afterthought. But by making these characters be special and have personalities, it made something different. It made something unique. And the story was told over 12 and later expanded up to, I want to say, 16 modules. So it's this huge story. And it doesn't hurt that it featured dragons either. Campaign world was, it was different. It was a little bit special. It was a little bit unique. And like you said, we'd been doing nothing but standard, generic, Tolkien-esque campaign settings, Forgotten Realms, and prior to that, Greyhawk, and they were just plain vanilla fantasy.
Yeah, I've heard Dragonlance described as the Star Wars story of D&D, and I don't think that's necessarily off the mark. It has this grand epic, I don't know. I mean, it's not Star Wars. I'm not saying it's just Star Wars with D&D trappings, but it has that, I don't know, kind of epic story level or something. So anyway, I've always been a big nerd, so thanks for that that kind of insight. That even as you were working on it, because of like Tracy's approach to it and everything, that you could tell that this was good stuff. So by the time you were working on DL4, was it already within the company was it apparent that like they had a hit with Dragonlance, or did the hit only happen with the books, or like when was it obvious that Dragonlance was like a big deal money wise?
I don't think I could put a specific line in the sand and say when, but it was pretty early on that they knew it was being successful.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I could tell you precisely when the realization hit. Definitely the novels were a big part of it because we had never done novels before. I mean, that was the opening foray into novels was Dragonlance. And, I think our audience had been hungry for years to have novelistic treatments of the games that they played and to be able to take the setting that actually featured story as opposed to, let's go into this castle and kill everything in there. And then let's go into this hole in the ground and kill everything there. And then let's go over to this tree hut and kill everything there. It really resonated with them. And, the sales on that were huge. They were enormous.
You're talking about novelization of the games and people being hungry for that. I didn't know that I was hungry for that until I encountered it. Mm-hmm. And like I picked up Dragons of Autumn Twilight, the novel, and I didn't realize until a little ways, I was like, this is novelized D&D. And I mean, it blew my mind. I was like, this is, yes. It was another one of those like moments, like, I can't believe this exists. I was so happy.
Yep.
Yeah, it was really cool. But, I also want to talk about Ravenloft. With your love of Ravenloft, you're talking about Tracy Hickman kind of giving that stamp to things more than just a generic, fantasy adventure or whatever. Like you mentioned, is romance. Ravenloft's basically a gothic romance. And then also, and I'm sure you know this story, but for the benefit of my listeners, where Ravenloft came from is Tracy Hickman was on a dungeon crawl and they ran into a vampire and like killed him or something. He's like, why is this vampire even here? Why is this vampire here in this dungeon? It's just some random vampire. And so that led him down the thought process to coming up with like Strahd and Ravenloft and all that.
Yeah.
So I've always thought that was really interesting. So he had that approach to things. Not that, and like we've said before, not that there's anything necessarily wrong with a dungeon crawl. They're fun, but it bugged him. He's like, why is this vampire here? He's just here, like randomly in this dungeon.
Take that approach to everything around about that time. It was like, okay, just putting a random creature in a room why is it there? What's the rationale? How's this work? And you start to see more and more of that seep into the other adventures as well.
So, I mean, it sounds like that you have respect for Tracy Hickman.
I definitely was very impressed with the stuff that he did. I worked with him, as in the same building with him for many years. So, we gamed together a few times, and yeah, I mean, he was definitely a good guy.
It's one of those things that would have been. I would love to be a fly on the wall, in some of those game sessions when the old TSR people were playing. That'd be a lot of fun. So. All right. Anyway, moving us on. I got to talk about video games a little bit, or else I'll probably get strung up with your history in video games. So you worked on Fallout. Well, first of all, let's go into this because it's been more and more common for me to run into this pattern of tabletop RPG designers making it into video game design.
Oh yeah, it's very common.
Yeah, talking about Zeb Cook and others. So how did that happen for you?
Well, for me, I was doing pretty well at TSR, and I had been doing more and more of the board games and the products that were trying to lure a younger audience into the game. And so I was, in much more contact with the upper management than most of the other designers as a result. And I kind of became disenchanted with the direction that TSR was beginning to head in. And at that same time, video games were starting to really hit their stride. Computers were getting more powerful, and the graphics were definitely a notch up. And me with my computer background, it was like, this is what I really want to do. I really want to go try my hand at this. So those two pressures, one carrot and one stick, kind of moved me out of TSR and into video games. And I applied it to Bethesda Softworks, and they were making, this monster role-playing game called Daggerfall. And, I wanted to be a part of that.
So your first job in video games was Bethesda?
Yes.
Okay.
I did interview at a couple other places, but Bethesda is, they were top of the list from the beginning.
And while you were at Bethesda, you worked on Elder Scrolls, Daggerfall. Up to Skyrim, where you were the lead designer of Skyrim, which is a big deal. So you did Elder Scrolls 2, Daggerfall. You worked on Oblivion. Did you work on Elder Scrolls 3?
No, I did not work on Morrowind.
Okay, so you worked on Daggerfall, Oblivion.
4 and 5.
So how hard, or I mean, what is required to become the lead designer on a version, like the new version of like a major franchise like that?
Well, in our case, Todd Howard had to see me as the best person to manage the staff and oversee the grand scale of the project. So it's not necessarily that you're the best designer, although it helps if you're a good one, but you have to be the kind of guy who can pull all the pieces in together and make sure that everybody's sort of rowing at the same time and at the same speed in the boat. And, he chose me to do that.
So what was that like? Was it like one of the hardest jobs you've had? Or I mean, like what, how long did it take? Like what was that like?
Well, Skyrim, I'm probably got a faulty memory here, but it was 3 to 3.5 years. And it's a team of over 100 people. And that's full paid staff members. That's not counting contractors, most of whom are artists. But so there's a lot of people. And while I did not oversee 100 people, I only oversaw the designers, which are the smaller group of, what would it be? somewhere between 15 and 20. I'd have to sit down and make a count to tell you the exact number. There's an enormous amount of coordination that goes on. You have to coordinate your efforts with all the other departments. You're overseeing all these other people's work. You're doing work yourself because Todd doesn't believe in having managers who are just managers. Managers are people who are doing work and then also do some management. And then you have to deal with Todd Howard and the other people who are reviewing the work and the constant cycle of changes. Anything that takes 3 to 3.5 years to complete, there's going to be things that crop up in the middle of that where it's like, no, we need to really change all of that, so throw all this stuff out and redo it. And that happened a few times on Skyrim. But he also trusted me to do, some really important things. The Radiant story system was something that I did a tremendous amount of work on. And the whole new spell system is the other thing that was principally my work. So it was definitely the hardest single project I've ever worked on, without any doubt.
So, sales-wise, Skyrim was a staggering success.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
And I'm sure that is incredibly personally satisfying for you. But did it throw doors open for you? People are like, oh, you need to come work on this huge project, and I mean, what was it like to be part of that, to be such a major role on such a successful game?
Here's the thing about Bethesda, particularly during those days. Bethesda's turnover rate, and Skyrim is over 10 years old now. Bethesda's turnover rate was almost non-existent. People who worked there stayed there. They just didn't leave. It was a really good place to work, and everybody wanted to be a part of it. The kinds of games they were making were setting the industry on its ear. And the company treated you really well. And so everybody was constantly getting offers. I was scouted numerous times and nobody was biting. And I didn't bite. I didn't want to go other places because a lot of other places at the time, they were not good places to work. The places that would have put me on big projects or paid me the big bucks or whatever combination of them it would be, were not going to be as good a working condition as what I had at Bethesda Softworks. And so there was like, why would I want to leave? I'm at the top, and all I'd be doing is taking a step down.
So what did you work on after Skyrim with Bethesda?
I worked on Fallout 3, Fallout 4, Fallout 76. I worked on Skyrim's DLC. When you're working on video games, the project time is extremely long compared to what we had at TSR. At TSR, you do a 32-page product in 1 month. That was the standard writing rate that you had. And when you did a big box set, 6 months was the most Jim would give you, no matter how many pages were in it. If that didn't break down into 32-page pieces, well, you just had to write faster. But here, you're talking about a 3 to 4 year project. And then the DLC were 6-month projects for the shortest ones. And that's, what the long pole was for the old TSR products. So it's a lot of work. And I think I've lost the thread of what your original question was.
Like, what was your video game career like going from such a major high point? Like, did you want that kind of role again? Or was it like, my main question was like, what happened next, which you've answered, but did you want to do that kind of lead designer role again? Or were you kind of trying to wind things down or?
Well, there were two principal people who were doing lead design work at Bethesda. That was myself and Emil Pagliarulo. And Emil was the Fallout guy. And it was his baby. He loved Fallout. He and Todd worked on that together. And so he was the lead designer for the Fallout projects. although not Fallout 76, because that was a very different kind of project. So for me, it was more a matter of waiting for the time to come for there to be an opportunity to have another lead designer role because Emma was going to be doing the Fallout pieces. But unfortunately, with 3 and 4 year lead times on these games, once you do Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 and Fallout 76, and now they're working on Starfield, time just ran out.
Right.
And, I don't know if I would have been offered a chance to do it on Elder Scrolls 6 or not. By that time, my last lead position had been a long time ago. So, there's absolutely no guarantee I would have even been offered it. When you're talking about a department that has 24 people in it, you're not necessarily always going to pick the same people to be your leads. So the competition's pretty intense. So, once you get that position, you have to be willing to understand that on the next one, you're not it. Emil was, after leading Fallout 3, he was not a lead for Skyrim. That went to me. And so he had to take a backseat role just like I did during Fallout 4.
Well, to respect your time, I know we've gone quite a while. I just have some quick questions here. When I dropped that message to Matt Barton in a group chat that I'm in with him, people were like, whoa, they were looking at everything you've done. So I got 2 or 3 questions from them, if that's okay. And then we can wrap up. And then I have to drop the bad joke on you because I do a bad joke every episode. So let me find
You mean werecow wasn't the bad joke?
That's not even a warm up. But you do need to go listen to the werecow. It goes, moo, 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 I'm a werecow. Okay, so here is the questions that came up. And, like I said, we could go into Fallout and this and that and the other, but hopefully you'll get to talk with Matt Barton. Or you're always welcome to back. I'd love to do a part 2 with you based just on your video game stuff. So my friend Matt Bradley Shurgi, he's a game journalist and does some other stuff. And you may, with your role with Oblivion, you may not know this, but he said Oblivion had a big celebrity in the beginning, Patrick Stewart. Do you know why they didn't do something like that for Skyrim?
Because we didn't feel we needed it.
Okay.
Oblivion was coming on the heels of Morrowind. And if you trace from Arena to Daggerfall to Morrowind, the products were on the ascendancy, but they hadn't really broken through to top tier. And for Oblivion, it was like, we need something that we can advertise and that we can promote to really get people to pay attention. So let's get a big name for the Emperor. And so they got Patrick Stewart, and he did a fabulous job. And when it came time to do Fallout 3, they got Ron Perlman and Liam Neeson to work on those. But for Skyrim, following up on Oblivion, it was like, okay, this is already a big deal. We don't need a big name actor. And you can usually only get them for a day's recording anyway. They don't want to be spending huge amounts of time on your project. They want to do one day in and out and get paid a big paycheck and go back to doing the other work that they do. So it's just, this is going to sell like hotcakes and we don't need it.
All right, fair enough. My friend Alan Valley, I should say, asked, and I'm assuming he means Skyrim, but I'll just ask the question as he's asking it. He said, how did they come up with the more you do it, the more your skill goes up system? And did they expect that it would break? For example, Sneak is 100, you can literally steal from someone right in front of them.
I'm pretty sure I played a seminal role in that, but it was a long time ago. So if somebody says that they were also involved in it or they actually came up with it just before me, I will bow to their knowledge. Okay. But I know I absolutely refined it, and I'm pretty sure I came up with it. But it was one of those things of, we wanted you not to have to think about the stats. We wanted you to just play the game. So the thing you do, you get better at. Don't worry about what your stats are. Just go do it. And as is pointed out in Oblivion, it was kind of broken. And in Skyrim, I spent a lot of time fixing it as best I could in Skyrim. And even then, there's there's some I just couldn't fix completely.
It's a computer system. I mean, that's the difference between a tabletop role-playing game and a computer role-playing game.
Yeah.
You have mathematical rules going on, and sometimes those mathematical interactions are not going to be perfect. And there's never enough time to fix everything.
Nope.
All right, final question from Robbie Sambat, who actually did the art for the cover of Dungeons & Desktop 2nd edition. And I guess this could apply to role-playing or video game or whatever. He says, any games he wishes he had worked on, and then he has a parenthetical, says, not that he needs more on his extensive resume.
I would have loved to have done a strategy game. I've always loved those. And I've been a huge Sid Meier's Civilization fan. And boy, would I have just killed to be a part of that. So, but, that wasn't going to be because Sid did it better than I would ever do it. And Bethesda doesn't do strategy games. But that would have been something I would have loved to have done, would have been a strategy game.
Well, fair enough. We'll wrap it there so that you can get back to your real life. A couple of things I want to mention here real quick. Well, actually, 3 things. One, thanks so much for your time.
A blast.
You were one of the guests that my time management got blown out the window because there's just too much interesting stuff to talk about. So, again, I appreciate your time. 2, folks, don't forget, check out Bruce's Mischief Maker. That's the name of it, right? Is it Mischief Maker?
Yep.
Yeah, Mischief Maker novel starring the one and only Loki, and there's a sequel in the works. I think you said it's already been delivered to your editor, if I remember right.
Yep. It is in the hands of my editor.
So go to shaneplays.com, check out the show notes for this episode. The Amazon link will be there, or just search for Mischief Maker by Bruce Nesmith. And last but never least, I have to drop the bad joke of the week on you.
Okay.
Bad joke of the week's a misnomer because I only do 2 or 3 episodes a month, but we just call it the bad joke of the week because it's easy and it sounds good. So bad joke of the week, here we go. In honor of your work on Skyrim and D&D and many other things involving skeletons, Bruce, how do you annoy a skeleton?
Ooh. I want to say it's something to do with funny bones, but I don't know. How do you annoy a skeleton?
Well, it's a trick question. You can't because nothing gets under their skin. There you go.
Yes, that's a dad joke.
Yes, sir. The worse, the better. But it's been absolutely wonderful talking to you, and thank you for regaling me with all of the fascinating information on your career. It's fascinating to me, and the closest I can ever come to being there is talking with people like you. So I truly appreciate your time in doing so.
No problem. Like I said, I had fun.
Okay, great. And I hope that Mischief Maker makes a lot of mischief on the charts and gets some good sales.
Me too.
Okay. And thanks so much again, Bruce, and everybody else. We will catch you next time on Shane Plays Geek Talk. Thanks so much for listening to Shane Plays Geek Talk. I certainly hope you enjoyed this journey into the things we love. For your convenience, show notes with helpful links for each episode can always be found at shaneplays.com. You can catch the podcast in several places, including on the blog at shaneplays.com, iTunes, Google Play Music, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Verbal, YouTube, and more. Shane Plays is also carried on sci-fi.radio. Sci-fi.radio is sci-fi for your Wi-Fi. SCIFI.radio. If you like what you hear and would like to support Shane Plays Geek Talk, you can do so for as little as $1 per episode on Patreon at patreon.com/ShanePlays. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time. Stay geeky, my friends.